The summer of 1886 took everything it could from Drover County. Everything except one farm.
She had spent 4 years fixing what others threw away. She did not know that was about to matter.
11 harvests were dying across the flat, and they were all coming to the same door.
He had called this place a boneyard. He had said it in public more than once.
Now he needed something only she had.
The lantern moved before the wagon did, a single point of amber swaying through the dark like something alive and uncertain of its own direction. Mabel Gorse held it at arm's length with her left hand and kept the reins gathered in her right, and the 2 draft horses, Clement and the younger one she still called Gray because she had never settled on anything better, leaned into the traces without complaint. Behind them, chained to the flatbed with logging chains she had borrowed from the shed and never returned, a machine that had not moved under its own power in at least 4 years, scraped and groaned across the rutted lane connecting the Pritchett property to the main road through Drover County. It was past 11. The September air had cooled enough to carry the smell of cut wheat from the fields along the creek bottom, and the sound the machine made dragging over loose stone was loud enough to wake a man sleeping with his windows shut. Mabel knew this. She had chosen 11 o'clock deliberately. No one came out to watch. No lantern appeared in any window she could see. And she completed the 3-mile pull back to Gorse Farm without speaking to anyone, without stopping, and without explaining herself to the dark. She unhitched Gray first, then Clement, rubbed both animals down with a piece of grain sack she kept looped through her belt during night work, and left the machine sitting at the edge of the west lot where the grass thinned to bare clay. She did not look at it again before going to bed. Whatever it was, whatever it might become, would wait until morning. This was the autumn of 1882. Hazel was 44 years old, had been a widow for 3 years, and had not asked a single person in Drover County for help since the morning she buried her husband in the churchyard outside Tulloch. Gorse Farm occupied 118 acres on the eastern slope of a long, shallow rise that the county maps labeled Sawgrass Ridge, but at which the people who farmed around it had always called, more honestly, the Flat. The soil was good in the low fields near the creek, and thin and reluctant everywhere else. Edmund Gorse had worked it for 19 years and had never quite made it pay what it cost him to run, and Mabel had inherited both the land and the arithmetic when the typhoid took him in late July of 1879. She also inherited a mortgage held by the Tulloch Savings and Agricultural Bank, a note that Amos Fetter had renewed in 1882 under terms he described as the best available under current condition, which meant the interest rate had climbed and the repayment window had shortened, and the margin between a workable year and a ruinous one had narrowed to something Mabel could measure without a ruler. She did not discuss the mortgage with neighbors. She did not discuss it with anyone. What she discussed, when she discussed anything at all, was weather and equipment and with the grain elevator in Tulloch, because those were the subjects that had consequences, and everything else was noise. Her father, Gideon Pratt, had been a blacksmith and a farmer in roughly equal measure, operating from a philosophy so simple it had never needed to be stated aloud. He understood how things were made, and because he understood how they were made, he understood how they broke. And because he understood both of those things, he could usually put them back together for less money than it cost to replace them. He had passed this way of thinking to Mabel the same way he had passed it to her 2 brothers, without ceremony and without particular intention, simply by letting her stand beside him in the forge and in the field, answering her questions when she asked them, and asking her questions in return until she stopped making the same mistakes twice. By the time Mabel was running Gorse Farm alone, she had a workshop behind the barn with a wood stove, a drill press, a bench vise, and enough hand tools to cover 2 walls. She had a shelf of technical manuals with their spines cracked from use. She had, more importantly, a working knowledge of every piece of equipment on the farm, deep enough to tell her not just when something was wrong, but where and why. What she did not have, and what the farm's income could not produce, was the money to buy the equipment a farm of this size was supposed to operate. The machine she pulled home from the Pritchett property that night was the 3rd she had brought onto the west lot in 4 months. The first had been a seed drill with a broken frame that a neighbor 2 miles north had left sitting in a ditch after deciding the repair cost more than the drill was worth. The second was a hay rake missing its reel assembly, which had cost Mabel nothing to acquire and 3 weeks to source parts for. The third, the one she had dragged back through the dark, was a machine she had identified from a notice in the Tulloch Weekly Courier where a man named Gerald Pritchett had listed for sale at $15. A Buckeye grain binder with what he described as a drought problem and possibly a small issue with the canvases. Mabel had looked at the machine in daylight before she made the offer. She had looked at the drive belt, which was cracked and needed replacing. She had looked at the canvases, which were stiff but intact. She had looked at the reel, the binder mechanism, the knotter. She had not looked, with the thoroughness the situation required, at the main crankshaft. She would spend the next 7 weeks wishing she had. The work began the morning after the machine arrived. Mabel replaced the drive belt first because it was the most obviously broken thing, and beginning with a problem has a satisfying logic to it, even when the obvious problem is not the only problem. She sourced new canvas from a harness maker in Tulloch who had remnants he was willing to sell by the yard. She adjusted the tension on the binder mechanism, cleaned the knotter, replaced 2 worn gear pins in the reel assembly. Each repair went into a composition notebook she had started keeping the previous spring, a record of what was wrong, what she did about it, and what the parts had cost. By the 3rd week, the machine looked better than it had when Pritchett sold it. By the 5th week, Mabel had persuaded herself it was ready. She ran it for 40 minutes on a dry morning in late October, taking it along the edge of the south field to see how it handled the stubble from the late oat harvest. The binder mechanism engaged cleanly. The canvases moved without catching. The drive belt, which she had adjusted twice since installation, held without slipping. Then the main crankshaft failed. There was no dramatic sound. There was a change in the engine's rhythm, a deepening unevenness that lasted perhaps 15 seconds and before the whole mechanism seized and the machine stopped moving forward. Mabel climbed down from the seat, stood in the stubble, and looked at the machine without touching it for a long moment. Then she crouched and looked underneath. The crankshaft had a fracture she should have found 2 months earlier. It ran laterally through the journal, the kind of crack that begins from a stress point and spreads invisibly over years of hard use until the day the metal finally surrenders all at once. She had replaced the belt. She had replaced the canvases and the gear pins. She cleaned every visible surface of the knotter assembly and documented each hour of labor in her notebook. She had done all of this without checking the structural component the entire machine depended on to move. She walked back to the workshop, sat down on the stool she kept next to the vise, and opened the notebook to a blank page. Buckeye binder, serial unknown, complete failure at first field trial. Crankshaft fracture, lateral journal section, failure caused by insufficient initial inspection, repaired secondary components without evaluating primary load-bearing structures. This sequence was backwards. It will not be repeated. $190 in parts and labor. Total loss. She sat with the notebook open for a while after writing this, not from grief or self-pity, but because the lesson needed time to settle properly into the place where she would not forget it. 7 weeks. $190 she had not had to spare. A machine now worth less than its individual parts. She closed the notebook. The next day, she began disassembling the Buckeye, labeling every component she removed, and storing anything still serviceable on the shelves along the west wall of the workshop, organized by function and by the machine models each part was compatible with. The failed crankshaft went onto a separate shelf with a tag that read, "Fracture, study piece, do not use." The machine she had ruined became the first permanent entry in what would eventually fill an entire cabinet. Parts that had come from something broken, waiting to repair something else. The new system took shape over the winter of 1882 into 1883, not as a deliberate plan but as a response to the specific way she had failed. If the error had been working from the outside in, examining what was visible before understanding what was structural, then the correction was to reverse the order entirely. Before touching a fastener on any machine she brought onto the property, she would complete 5 separate evaluations and document each one before proceeding to the next. The first evaluation was the frame and primary load-bearing structures. Every shaft, axle, and main casting inspected visually, tested physically where possible, measured against known tolerances where she had them. The second was the power transmission system, gears, belts, chains, clutch mechanisms, anything that moved force from the engine or the draft animals to the working components. The third was the working components themselves, the cutters, rollers, lifters, knotters, whatever the specific machine was designed to do. The fourth was all secondary mechanical systems, lubrication, adjustment mechanisms, tension hardware. The fifth was the hitch and draft system, the connection between the machine and the animal or the engine pulling it. Nothing moved to stage 2 until stage 1 was completed and written down. The notebook was not optional. The notebook was the system. She built a second set of shelves in the workshop during February of 1883, these organized not by part type but by machine model, so that when she acquired the manuals for a specific piece of equipment, she could file what she learned alongside the physical parts it applied to. She wrote the machine model on the shelf edge in black paint, the year of manufacture when she knew it, and when she did not know it, she wrote est, followed by her best guess and the reasoning behind it, which was usually the style of the casting marks and the hardware standards of the period. This was all invisible from the road. It was invisible from the neighboring properties. It was invisible to everyone in Tulloch who used the word boneyard when they referred to the west lot behind her barn, which was everyone who talked about her at all. Fordham Briley talked about her more than most. He was 58 years old and had farmed 640 acres and drove a Keen's for Mabel's father had established his forge, and he carried the physical certainty of a man who had been right about important things often enough that he had stopped seriously considering the possibility he might be wrong about anything. He served on the board of the Drover County Agricultural Society. He had credit at 3 different banks. When he spoke in the feed store on a Monday morning, other men inclined their heads slightly in his direction, and not all of them were aware they were doing it. He had said, in the fall of 1882, in the presence of 6 men at the counter of the Tulloch Farm Supply, that the widow Gorse was collecting junk instead of selling her land, and that someone ought to tell her that stubbornness and practicality were different things. He said it without rancor, the way a man states a fact he has observed, and 2 of the 6 men agreed audibly, and the other 4 said nothing, which Briley counted as agreement of a different kind. Mabel heard this secondhand, as she heard most things said about her, through a neighbor who reported it with the half-apologetic quality of someone delivering news they had not chosen to carry. She thanked the neighbor for telling her. She did not respond to Briley directly, and she did not respond indirectly, and the following week she drove to a farm 8 miles south and came back with a seed drill that the owner had left in his machine shed for 6 years because the disc blades needed replacing, and he had decided it was easier to rent equipment during planting season than to deal with it. This was how the spring of 1883 went, and the summer, and the fall. By the following autumn, the west lot held 7 machines in various states of evaluation or repair. 2 were complete losses whose parts had been redistributed to the shelves. 3 were in active progress. 1 was finished, rebuilt from a condition that 2 separate farmers had described as hopeless. The last was the seed drill from the farm 8 miles south, which had taken Mabel 11 weeks to fully restore because the disc blades had corroded in ways the visible surface had not predicted, and she had needed to source replacements from a manufacturer's agent who traveled through twice a year. The restored machine was a Marsh grain harvester, 14 years old, with a rebuilt cutting bar, new canvas carriers, a reground knife section, and a crankshaft she had inspected with a piece of thin wire looped through the journal to feel for irregularity in the bore's surface before she had done anything else to it. The crankshaft was sound. She had confirmed this before she had replaced a single other component. She put it to work on Gorse Farm that September, and it handled the wheat field on the north slope without a mechanical complaint for 9 days running. At the end of the harvest, she cleaned it, lubricated every fitting, adjusted the knife tension for storage, then wrote the complete summary in the notebook. Every part, every hour invested, every dollar spent, and the final assessment. Fully operational, suitable for sale or continued use. She listed it for $50 list. This was a fraction of what a new harvester cost, and more than some people to pay for something that had arrived on the property as what most of the county was pleased to call wreckage. Cass Weldon came to look at it on a Thursday. He was 38, farmed 112 acres east of Gorse Farm, and had been buying used equipment his entire adult life out of the same financial necessity that governed most of the smaller operations in Drover County. He was not a man who said very much, but what he did say tended to be accurate. He walked around the Marsh harvester twice, crouched to look at the cutting bar, ran his thumb along the canvas carrier and felt the tension in it. What was wrong with it? Mabel listed the repairs in the order she had made them, beginning with the initial inspection of the crankshaft and ending with the knife section. Cass stood up and looked at her with the expression of someone recalculating a figure that had not come out the way they expected. He bought the harvester that afternoon for $48, which was the price, after he noted that the real timing was slightly off, and she agreed it was, and knocked $2 off rather than argue. He used it through the harvest season without a single mechanical failure and came back in October to tell her so, not as a compliment but as information, the way he's information about most things. That transaction was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. Fordham Briley took delivery of 3 McCormick advance harvesters in the spring of 1885. The machines came on a flat car from the east and were unloaded at the Tulloch Depot on a Tuesday morning with enough ceremony to draw a gathering of perhaps 20 men, several of whom had driven in specifically to see the new equipment. The McCormick Advance was the most technologically ambitious grain harvester available for purchase in the American Midwest in that year. It featured a revised gear train cast from a new iron formulation developed at the manufacturer's foundry, a self-adjusting canvas tension system, and a reel speed that could be modified without stopping the machine, which no harvester of the previous generation had been able to do. Briley organized a demonstration on Sawgrass Flats at the end of that week. He invited every significant farmer in Drover County. In practice, every farmer whose operation exceeded 200 acres, plus the county extension officer and the editor of the Tulloch Weekly Courier. The machines moved through a standing field of rye that Briley had left unharvested for the purpose, and they moved with an efficiency and certainty that was genuinely impressive even to men who had seen a great deal of farm equipment operate over long careers. The extension officer made notes. The newspaper editor sketched the machines in a pocket notebook with a level of technical inaccuracy that would become evident when the sketch was printed. Mabel was not invited. She learned about the demonstration on Saturday from Cass Weldon, who had attended and described it in his particular way, which was to say what had happened without adding what he thought about it, leaving her to form her own conclusions from the facts. She had formed one, a machine designed with a revised casting formulation that no one in Drover County had previously encountered, operating under Kansas harvest conditions that imposed particular stresses on iron components, sustained vibration, intermittent shock loads, heat expansion and contraction through the debris. Was a machine whose long-term performance characteristics were not yet known. The demonstrations were a day old. The enthusiasm was several weeks ahead of the evidence. She did not say this to anyone. She went back to the west lot where a mowing machine with a damaged pitman arm was waiting for the third stage of its 5-stage evaluation, and she went back to work. That autumn, Cass stood at the edge of the demonstration field after the crowd had cleared and looked at the 3 McCormick advance machines being walked back to Briley's equipment shed by hired hands. He had watched the machines closely during the demonstration, watched specifically the gear train covers because a man who has spent 20 years operating used equipment, the development instinct for what makes noise that should not make noise, and one of the 3 machines had made a sound during the demonstration that he could not fully account for. He went home. He did not mention this to anyone except eventually Mabel, and that was months later and under very different circumstances. The summer of 1886 was the driest that Drover County had recorded since 1874. By the second week of July, the creek running through the low field on the east side of Gorse Farm had dropped to a trickle between banks of cracked clay, and the paddock grass had gone the color of saw straw so early in the season that the cattle grazing it were burning. Feed Mabel had budgeted for October. Temperature held at above 100 degrees for 11 consecutive days in late July, and the fine silica dust the wind lifted from the drying topsoil across sawgrass flats moved through the air like smoke and found its way into everything, into the workshop, into the water barrel, into the mechanism of every piece of equipment running in the open air. Drover County's wheat and rye came ripe in the second week of August. The harvest season began, as harvest seasons always began, with a collective held breath, a sense of organized urgency, and the sound of machinery starting across the flat in the early morning while the air was still cool enough to work in comfortably. Fordham Briley's 3 McCormick advance harvesters went into the fields on a Monday. By Wednesday afternoon, 2 of them had stopped. The failure was not immediately identifiable to the hired hands operating the machines. One had developed a roughness in its gear train that the operator initially attributed to debris in the mechanism and had attempted to clear before the roughness became a grinding and the grinding became a full seizure. The second stopped more abruptly, a sharp sound during a turn, followed by complete loss of function in the drive system. Briley's farm manager, a practical man named Hollis who had operated farm equipment for 30 years, looked at both machines before sending for a mechanic, and what saw in the gear train housings told him the problem was not debris and was not operator error. The gear teeth had fractured, not worn, not cracked at the surface and gradually deteriorating. Fractured, cleanly, in the manner of metal stressed past a threshold it could not recover from. The third machine showed the same symptom the following morning, before it had completed a full day of operation. Briley sent for the equipment dealer in Tulloch, who sent a telegram to the regional distributor, who sent a man by train from the regional office. The man arrived on Friday, spent 2 hours examining the machines, then wrote a letter to the manufacturer that was careful in its language and specific in its technical description, and which communicated between its polite lines that the gear components installed in the advanced model's revised drive system were failing at a rate not attributable to operating conditions alone. The gear teeth, cast from a new iron formulation in a revised, thinner profile, were fracturing under the combination of sustained high heat and the fine abrasive silica dust unique to a Kansas summer of severity. The formulation that had performed adequately in the manufacturer's testing conditions could not hold its integrity here. What the letter also communicated, said only once and in careful language, was that replacement gears would need to come from the manufacturer's supply warehouse, and that given the number of similar reports arriving from other regions, the supply situation was constrained. The delivery timeline was 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. Wheat and rye did not wait 4 to 6 weeks. The crop standing in Briley's fields on the day his machines failed was a crop that would be damaged beyond recovery in 10 days if the weather turned, and the weather in late August in Kansas was under no obligation to cooperate with anyone's equipment troubles. Within 48 hours of Briley's machine stopping, 9 of the 12 McCormick Advanced Harvesters operating in Drover County had failed with the same fracture pattern and the same components. The 3 that had not failed had been purchased a year earlier from a different production batch and carried gear components cast under the original formulation rather than the revised one. These 3 machines were running at capacity on their owners' properties and were not available to anyone else. The county sat in the middle of a harvest it could not complete. Cass Weldon drove to Gorse Farm on the Thursday morning after his own machine, the Marsh Harvester, 14 years old, with its carefully inspected crankshaft and its forged iron gears of the previous generation, had completed its second full day in his wheat field without a single mechanical interruption. He pulled his wagon into the farmyard and sat in it for a moment before climbing down, because the scene in front of him required a moment. Mabel was in the north field, visible from the gate, running one of her own restored machines through the standing wheat at a pace that was unhurried and methodical, and entirely, noticeably functional. The machine was old enough that a man unfamiliar with equipment could not have identified its manufacturer without looking at a catalog from the previous decade. Its gear train made no fractured sounds. Its drive system did not seize. It moved through the crop with the regularity of something that had been properly understood before it had been put to work. Cass stood at the fence long enough that Mabel completed 2 full passes across the width of the field and turned for a third before he moved. When she finally stopped the machine at the field's edge to check the knife tension, a check she made on a schedule rather than in response to symptoms, she found him waiting. He said what he had come to say: his machine was running, his harvest was proceeding, and whatever it had done to the Marsh Harvester 2 years before, it had been right. He stopped. He looked at the field. Riley's got 3 machines sitting in the dirt. 11 other men the same. They're looking for anything that runs. Mabel wiped the grease from her hands with the rag from her belt pocket. The machine she had been running was a harvester she had brought on the property in the winter of 1883 in worse condition than the Buckeye binder that had taught her the most expensive lesson of her early years. She had spent 22 months on it, working through its 5-stage evaluation 3 separate times, because the first evaluation had turned up complications requiring her to restart the process after addressing structural issues the initial inspection had found. It had cost her more in labor than in parts, and more in patience than in either. It ran because she had not started with the visible problems. It ran because she did not assume that what she could see was the whole of what mattered. She had 3 additional machines on the property that were operational and not currently committed to her own harvest. A 4th was 2 weeks of work away from operational, which was not close enough. The West lot held machines in various stages of the 5-stage process that were not ready for anything except their next evaluation. She looked at the field she still needed to bring in. She looked at Cass. "Tell me who's in the worst shape," she said. By the following Monday, Mabel had established a lending system on a piece of pine board mounted to the workshop wall with 2 horseshoe nails. Each of her 3 operational machines had its own row listing the machine's current condition, its capacity in acres per day under reasonable operating conditions, and the name of the farmer currently using it or next in line. The assignments were not made by how long she had known someone or how well she liked them. They were made by which crops were in the greatest immediate danger of loss. The first 3 assignments were not difficult. A farmer southwest of Tulloch, with 80 acres of rye ready to fall, had no machine of any kind and no money to rent one. An older man named Duval, who farmed alone since his son had gone to work in a city 2 years previous, had 160 acres of wheat at peak and an injured hand that made it difficult to operate any machinery. So Mabel sent Cass with the machine and the understanding that Cass would run it through Duval's field before bringing it back. The 4th assignment was harder because Fordham Briley's hired man came to the farm on Tuesday morning. He was a young fellow with a careful manner and the look of someone given a job he was uncertain how to complete. He explained that Mr. Briley had 380 acres in wheat and rye that needed attention, and that Mr. Briley was prepared to offer fair compensation for the use of any available equipment. He said this with the neutrality of a person delivering a message from someone who had told him precisely what to say. Mabel listened until he finished. "Tell Mr. Briley that I'm happy to discuss it, but I'll need to discuss it with him directly." The hired man blinked. He had clearly not been given instructions for this response. She was not unkind about it. She said it again, slightly differently, made clear she was serious, and the young man went back the way he had come. She returned to the workshop and updated the pine board. 380 acres, 3 fields, from what she understood of the Briley property's layout. The wheat in the south section had been standing longest and was statistically the most vulnerable. She ran the numbers in her head while talking to the hired man, not because she needed to, but because calculating the problem was how she kept the emotional texture of it at a distance she could manage. She did not feel satisfaction about Briley's machines failing. She had genuinely not wished it. What she felt working through the logistics on the pine board with a stub of pencil was the particular focused calm that came from a problem with a clear set of variables and a limited set of solutions. Fordham Briley arrived at Gorse Farm the following morning. He came alone, rode a bay horse rather than driving a biggie, and dismounted at the gate with the deliberate ease of a man who was not going to let his physical movements reveal what the situation was costing him. He was wearing his working clothes, not his meeting clothes. He walked across the farmyard and stopped at a distance, indicating he was not planning to make the conversation longer than it needed to be. He did not look at the west lot. She noticed this specifically. "I need a harvester. 380 acres. I'll pay whatever it costs." Mabel had worked through the variables on the pine board the day before and had a decision already made. 380 acres was a real number, and the risk to his fields was real, and she did not allow her assessment to be influenced by who he was or what he had said about her at the feed store counter 4 years ago. That was not the kind of accounting she kept. She told him she could lend him the large harvester currently stored in the east bay of the barn, the one that had taken her 22 months of intermittent work to bring back from the condition it had arrived in. It was the best machine she had. The capacity was right for his acreage. The conditions are simple. You operate it yourself, or you put someone on it who knows what they're doing and will treat it accordingly. You bring it back in the same condition you receive it. If anything changes in how it's running while you have it, any sound, any roughness, anything that wasn't there when you started, you stop and you send for me. You don't try to diagnose it yourself. Briley looked at her. The quality of the look was different from anything that had passed between them in the years he had been making comments about her west lot in public spaces. Not softer, exactly. Adjusted. Agreed. She walked him to the east bay and showed him the machine. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has surprised him. Not with enthusiasm, but with the recalculation that happens when an assumption proves incorrect. The machine was old, and it was not pretty, but it was clean, tight in every adjustable fastener, and had the particular stillness of equipment that is not currently broken. She walked him through the starting sequence, showed him the points that needed lubrication after every 4 hours of operation, showed him where the knife tension adjusted and at what measurement it should sit. She did not tell him anything she would not have told anyone else borrowing equipment that mattered to her. He loaded the machine onto his wagon and drove out of the farmyard without further conversation. She watched him go from the barn door, then turned back to the pine board and updated the entry for the large harvester with his name and the date and the field acreage. Then she went back to work on her own harvest, because the wheat Gorse Farm did not know anything about Fordham Briley's troubles or her own history with them, and it was not going to wait. The afternoon was hot enough that the air above the cut stubble shimmered in the distance. The stubble got to dust moving through those lights in slow, golden incurrent, some beyond the tree line, apple on the side of the property. One of her borrowed machines was running through a field that might otherwise have been lost, and the sound it made was even and unremarkable, which was the best sound any machine could make. The pine board held 7 names by the end of the first week. Mabel had added 2 on Wednesday, 1 on Thursday, when a farmer named Heck Sutter drove in from the northwest quarter with his hat in his hands, and a tone of voice that told her he was a man who had not asked for help in a long time and was finding it difficult, and a 4th on Friday afternoon when Cass came back from Duval's property and reported that the old man's south field was in worse shape than anyone had realized because Duval had been too proud to say how much acreage he actually had standing. She updated the board in pencil so she could change it. The names shifted positions as she learned more. Which fields had the worst exposure to the afternoon wind that accelerated the drying? Which soils held moisture long enough to give an extra day's margin? Which farmers had enough hired help to run a borrowed machine through the night with lanterns if they needed to? These were not social calculations. They were agronomic ones, and she ran them with the same systematic attention she gave to the 5-stage machine evaluation. What she did not have was enough machines to run all 7 names simultaneously. She had 3 operational harvesters on loan and 1 running in her own fields, and her own fields were not finished. And every day she spent entirely coordinating other people's harvests was a day her own wheat stood one afternoon storm closer to being flattened in the rows. She started at 4 in the morning. What was unusual was that she did not stop at the end of the daylight because she had never needed to track so many moving pieces at once, and the tracking did not fit neatly inside the hours she had previously assigned to it. By the 9th day, she was writing entries in the notebook with handwriting that was not as precise as she preferred, which was how she knew the accumulated fatigue was real and not a thing she could simply decide not to feel. The emergency came on the afternoon of the 9th day in the form of a boy on a horse who arrived at the Gorse Farm gate at a speed communicating urgency before he said a word. He was 14, probably with the burned forearms of a kid who worked outside all summer, sent by a farmer named Albright who had the large harvester Mabel had lent to the widow Stearns on Stearns' recommendation, because Albright's field was adjacent and they had agreed informally to share the machine for a day. The machine had started making a sound. Mabel set down the transmission components she had been cross-referencing carefully rather than quickly and asked the boy 2 questions. What kind of sound and when exactly in the operating cycle did it occur? He described something that happened when the machine turned at the end of a row. A roughness in the gear train that smoothed out when the machine went straight again. She took her tool bag from the hook on the workshop wall, 2 quarts of machine oil from the shelf, and the specific wrench set she needed for the gear housing on a harvester of that age and generation, then drove to Albright's property at a pace that was not panicked but was not leisurely either. The machine was sitting at the edge of the field when she arrived, Albright standing beside it. He had stopped it when the boy left, which was the right decision, and he said so before she asked. She opened the gear housing on the lower drive assembly. The problem was immediately visible. A partial displacement in the drive chain idler that had been allowed to operate slightly misaligned, which under straight line running created only a minor additional load, but under the lateral stress of a field turn was introducing enough secondary vibration to threaten the chain links themselves. 2 more turns and she would have been looking at a snapped chain and a machine that would not move under its own power until she replaced it. 35 minutes. The realignment, the tension adjustment, the chain inspection link by link, the lubrication of 3 points she found dry while in the housing, and the documentation in the notebook, which she completed even here in the field in the heat, because the notebook was not a formality she could skip when conditions were inconvenient. She showed Albright where the idler sat and how to check its alignment by feel, running his thumb along the chain contact surface and comparing the resistance on both sides. She made him do it twice. The check itself, not just watch her do it, because there is a difference between understanding a thing intellectually and understanding it through your hands. She looked up because the particular quality of silence to her left had changed in the way it changes when a person has stopped moving. Fordham Briley was standing 20 yards from the machine. He was on horseback, having come around the tree line from the direction of his own south, which bordered Albright's property along the fence parallel to the creek. He had not announced himself. He was watching with an expression she could not fully read at this distance, though she could read the stillness in it. The stillness of a man who has seen something that has revised his understanding of a situation he thought he had already assessed. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Albright and finished showing him the alignment check. When she straightened up and turned, Briley had gone. The evening of the 9th day should have been an evening like the evenings before it. It was not. Mabel came back from Albright's field at 5:30, unhitched the wagon horse, fed the animals, checked the notebook entry she had made in the field against the pine board, and sat down in the workshop on the stool next to the vise. Her hands rested on the open notebook. The page showed the day's entries, detailed and correctly sequenced, written in handwriting that had deteriorated across the day in ways she had not noticed while writing. The letters at the top of the page were Mabel's letters. The letters at the bottom were close, but the angle had changed and the pressure was inconsistent. She had not eaten since morning. She recognized this as a fact without feeling it as hunger, which was itself a symptom she knew well enough to take seriously. She heard boots on the path outside. Cass came through the workshop door with his lantern in one hand, a cupboard pot in the other, and behind him came 2 men she knew by sight. Owen Greer, from the quarter section east of Cass's property, and a man named Petit, who had a farm on the North Road and had been one of the 7 names on the pine board since the previous Thursday. They were wearing their slightly better working clothes, which told her this was a decided thing and not something that had happened on the way to something else. Cass set the pot on the bench. He looked at her with the pragmatic directness of someone who has assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion. You've been running since before we were awake. Petit and Owen and me will take the coordination through the night. You tell us what needs to happen and then you sleep. What she was considering was not whether she could trust Cass with the pine board. She was considering whether stepping back from the system she had built, even for 8 hours, would introduce errors she could not see from the outside. The pot smelled like beef and root vegetables. Her hands on the notebook were steadier than she wanted them to be, because if they were completely steady, she could argue she did not need to stop. But they were not completely steady. She showed Cass the board. She walked him through the priority sequence and the overnight considerations, which machines had been running longest without a lubrication check, which fields were closest to where a day's delay would become 2 days of damage rather than 1. She told him about the idler on the machine at Albright's property and what he should ask about if anyone sent word from that direction. Cass listened without interrupting. He asked one question about the tolerance on the knife tension of the mid-size harvester, and she answered it, and he did not ask it again. She ate. She slept for 6 hours. She was at the pine board before Cass and the other 2 men had finished their coffee. Prudy Holst had been appearing at the edge of the farmyard for 3 days before she actually said anything. Mabel had noticed her on the Tuesday of the second week, a young woman of 19 with dark hair pulled back under her work hat and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who are comfortable watching without being watched in return. She stood at the fence near the barn on the outside of it, looking at the west lot with an attention that was not the casual curiosity of someone passing by. On Wednesday, she was in roughly the same position. On Thursday, she came closer, though still outside the fence line. On Friday morning, she was at the workshop door when Mabel arrived to open it. She had a quality of directness that did not come from confidence exactly, but from having decided something and not wanting to waste time on the approach to it. I want to learn what you know.
About the machines.
Mabel was carrying the tool bag and the notebook. She set the tool bag down. I don't have time to teach anyone right now. I know. Prudy had anticipated this. I won't ask questions. I'll watch, and I'll stay out of the way, and I won't slow you down. Mabel considered this. A person who watches carefully and stays out of the way is not a burden in the same category as a person who asks questions at the wrong moment. And she had found over the years that some of the most useful things she had learned about the machines on her property she had learned from watching someone else's hands without the interruption of either person's words. Don't touch anything without being told. Don't move anything. Don't assume. Prudy nodded and nothing else, not asking what had been meant because she had understood it. She spent the rest of Friday following at a distance close enough to see, without being close enough to interfere. On Saturday, she was there before Mabel. On Sunday, she helped, without being asked, to carry the tool bag between the workshop and the wagon, and when she handed it over, she handed it correctly by the main strap so that the contents did not shift. By the end of the second week, the worst of the immediate crisis had stabilized in the way that crises stabilize not through resolution, but through the gradual exhaustion of their own worst possibilities. Several farmers whose machines were beyond waiting had managed informal arrangements among themselves, sharing the few functional McCormick advance units from the earlier production batch across properties in a rotating that was less efficient than it should have been, but was better than nothing. The borrowed harvesters from Gorse Farm had moved through their first rotation, and 2 of them had come back and gone out again to second assignments. Fordham Briley's large harvester came back on a Friday morning. He drove it himself on a horse-drawn wagon with 2 hired hands walking behind, and the machine was returned in the condition she had specified, which she knew before because she could see from the yard that it was clean. A man who has run dirty equipment all his working life and cleans it before returning, it is communicating something through the act, whether or not he is aware of it. She conducted the receiving inspection herself with Prudy, at her shoulder watching, not touching. She went through the lubrication points, the knife tension, the gear housing, the drive chain, the canvas carriers. Everything was in order. Briley stood in the yard while she inspected. He had not tried to supervise it. He had not filled the time with conversation. When she came out of the barn, he was in the same position he had taken when she went in, near the gate, not quite inside the farmyard, as if uncertain whether the visit had fully earned him the right to be entirely within it. Mabel recorded the final inspection note and closed the notebook. It came back sound. I used it the way you told me to. He paused. 340 acres. Lost 40 in the south corner before I got to it. Would have been worse, she said. The 40 that was lost. Was that the field corner with the north exposure? He looked at her. Yes. That field corner always dries unevenly. The wind funnels down from the ridge into it. You'd have lost that section in any year this dry machine or not. He processed this for a moment. It was information that did not comfort him and did not blame him and did not ask him to feel anything in particular about it, which was perhaps why he received it without defensiveness. I watched you work on Albright's machine from the field line. I saw you. What was wrong with it? She told him. She described the idler displacement and the alignment check and the consequence that would have followed if the machine had run another 2 or 3 turns with the load distributed the way it was. She described it in the same specific language she used in the notebook because she did not have a simpler version and was not interested in developing one. Briley listened with an attention she had not seen from him in social contexts. This was the attention of a man taking in information he needed. I've been wrong about what you do here. It came out with the bluntness of a sentence reconsidered until everything decorative had been stripped from it. I don't have a better way to say it. Mabel picked up tool bag. The machine is in the East Bay if you need it again before the season ends. Thank you. It was not a comfortable thing for him to say, and it did not sound comfortable, and she found this more credible than if it had sounded easy. She went back to the workshop. The farmers who had borrowed machines from Gorse Farm were returning them, which meant they were also coming back to the property for the inspections Mabel required of all returned equipment. And while they were watching Prudy learn, and watching Cass ask questions, and watching the systematic process by which Mabel moved through a machine from the primary structure outward. 3 of them, on 3 separate occasions, asked questions, not about their specific machines, but about the process. The first was Heck Sutter, watching Mabel confirm the gear housing torque on the drive shaft before recording the final inspection. He is with the slightly sideways quality of a man he is not sure is appropriate to ask how she knew to check that particular fastener on this type of machine and not a different one. She explained the load path through the drive assembly and why the housing torque at that specific point mattered more than the same measurement on a machine of a different generation. She explained it while still working, not stopping, because stopping would have cost her 20 minutes she did not have. Sutter followed the explanation in a way that told her he was mechanical enough to understand it and had simply never been told. The second and third questions from different men on different days were variations on the same theme. How did you know where to look? What told you the problem was there and not somewhere more visible? These were good questions asked by men who had operated farm equipment for decades without developing a systematic framework for understanding how equipment was designed to fail. They had learned, as most farmers learned, by breaking things and replacing the broken part. The correct response to a broken part, but not a complete approach to the question of what the machine needed in order not to break. Mabel began, without deciding to, answering these questions fully. Not as instruction, she was not stopping work to teach, but as narration of her own thinking process while the work was happening, so that the answer to how did you know was demonstrated rather than described in the abstract. Prudy absorbed this differently from the visiting farmers. She had produced a notebook of her own, a different size than Mabel's, with a narrower page, making entries in a handwriting that was smaller and faster, but organized in a way Mabel recognized as systematic. She had developed, apparently without being told, a shorthand for part names, and she used it consistently from day to day. Mabel said nothing about the notebook. She noted it. She continued working. It was during the third week, on a day when the heat had finally dropped enough that the morning air smelled of something other than baked clay, that Cass told her what he had seen at the McCormick demonstration in 1885. He told her because she asked, and she asked because she had been thinking, during the slow hours of the evening inspections, about the failure pattern in the McCormick advanced machines. She had constructed in her mind an account of how a revised casting formulation in a gear tooth, under sustained heat and fine abrasive particulate, would predictably fail, and she wanted to know if anything at the demonstration had been consistent with that prediction in retrospect. Cass had heard a sound during the ride demonstration from one of the 3 machines, the one on the left side of the field. He had heard it, had not known what it meant, and had filed it with the other things he heard and did not fully understand, which was a large category for him at that time. She asked him to describe it. He did. It was a sound that occurred intermittently, not continuously, with a frequency and quality fitting precisely with the early stage of gear tooth stress fracture under an irregular load, the slight harmonic irregularity preceding visible damage by dozens of operating hours. Most people would not have heard it. Most people who heard it would not have distinguished it from normal mechanical noise. Cass had heard it and distinguished it without knowing what it meant. You noted something most men wouldn't have. He considered this in his typical way, neither accepting nor deflecting it. Didn't know what to do with it. You do now. He looked at her. What I showed you with Albrecht's idler, she said. What you know about the drive chain check schedule. What you told Petit about the lubrication points on the Midsus Harvester last week while I was at Duval's property. She was not listing these things to compliment him. She was pointing to a pattern he had not named for himself. You know more than you think you know. You knew it before you came here. You just didn't have the framework to use it. Cass turned this over with the patience that was not insolence but thoroughness. He looked at the pine board, which now had 10 names on it, 3 with notation marks, meaning the machine had been returned and re-inspected. What happens when the McCormick parts finally come in and everyone goes back to their own equipment? She had been asking herself this for several days, which meant she had an answer not fully settled, but far enough along to say out loud. Some of them will go back to exactly the way they operated before. Some of them won't. She was looking at the pine board as she said it, the 10 names, 7 of whom had stood in this workshop at various points over the past 2 weeks and watched her do something they had not previously known could be done, and had left understanding slightly more than they had arrived with. The replacement gears from the McCormick manufacturer began arriving at the Tulloch depot in the 4th week, trickling in on the freight trains, in quantities that addressed the most critical cases first and left others waiting. As the McCormick machines came back online one by one across Drover County, the pressure on Gorse Farm's lending system gradually eased. Borrowed harvesters came back, were serviced in the ways the inspection identified, and went into the barn. But not all the traffic stopped. Sutter came back on a Thursday, not because he needed a machine or had one to return, but because he had a question he had been sitting with since his first week at the farm. He had a hay rake on his property that he had been running in a degraded condition for 2 seasons, because the part it needed was one he had not known where to source. What he wanted to know was whether she knew of a source and what he was looking at in terms of cost. Mabel knew the part. She had stripped an identical component from a hay rake she had acquired and cannibalized 3 years earlier, one that had failed in the second stage of its evaluation due to frame damage she could not repair economically. The part was on the shelf with a tag reading the model number and the conditions assessment she had written the day she removed it. She took him to the shelf. He stood in front of it for a moment and looking at a wall of organized, labeled, salvaged components from perhaps 40 pieces of equipment over as many years, organized with the specificities suggesting each item had been considered individually rather than collected in bulk and sorted by memory. How long did this take to build? It was not a question she had thought about in terms of time. She looked to the shelf. Since 1882. Longer if you count what my father started. Sutter found the component, pulled the tag, read her assessment. He put it back carefully in exactly the position he had found it. What do you want for it? She named a price that was fair and below what a new part would have cost, and he paid it without negotiation. He was back the following week with his neighbor, who had a different question about a different machine. His neighbor came back with 2 other men. The workshop that had always been full of machines and empty of people was, by the end of August, full of both. It was on a Saturday at the end of the 4th week that Prudy said a full sentence in Mabel's presence that was not a response to a direct question. She said it while Mabel was in the second stage of evaluating a mowing machine that had come onto the property in the spring and had been sitting in the west lot through the entire crisis, testing the power transmission shaft. By turning it slowly by hand and listening, Prudy was watching from the correct position, close enough to see, far enough not to interfere. The bearing on the secondary shaft. The resistance changes at about 40 degrees. Mabel stopped. She turned the shaft again, slowly, specifically to that position. The resistance changed at about 40 degrees. It was subtle, the kind of subtle a person finds when they have been told it is there, but Prudy had not been told. Prudy had heard it without being cued. Mabel looked at the young woman. Prudy was looking at the shaft housing with the attention she had maintained since her first morning at the farm, the expression of someone who is watching rather than performing watching. How long have you been hearing that? Since Tuesday? 4 days. Prudy had been carrying this observation for 4 days without saying it because she had not been asked, because the rule she had been given at the beginning was to watch and not assume, and she had honored that rule more scrupulously than most adults would have. Mabel crouched and found the bearing. It had developed a flat spot on its race, a defect not visible from any external inspection point, only audible through the transmission of the shaft, and only audible to someone who was listening in exactly the way Prudy had been listening. She removed the bearing, held it in the light from the workshop door, located the flat spot with her thumbnail. She held it in her left hand for a moment. You could have said this 4 days ago. It was not a reprimand. Prudy met her eyes. You said not to assume. I was waiting until I was sure. Mabel put the bearing on the bench. What she found, looking at the young woman with the dispassionate clarity she brought to evaluating everything on the property, was someone who had not only watched correctly for 3 weeks, but had developed, without instruction, the particular discipline of distinguishing between what she observed and what she knew, and had understood that these were not the same thing. The bearing is on the north end of the second shelf from the top. 3rd section. Bring it and the installation tool beside it. Prudy went. She returned with both items in the correct carrying position. They worked through the bearing replacement together, which was the first time Mabel had used the word together in relation to any task on this farm in the 3 years since Edmund died. The crisis officially ended for most of Drover County when the last of the McCormick advanced machines received its replacement gear set in the first week of September. The repair crews from the regional distributor completed their circuit of the county and departed, and the machines that had been standing silent in fields and equipment sheds through the worst of August went back to work. The damage assessment, which Mabel formed from accounts of the men who passed through the workshop over those weeks, was uneven. Farmers who had secured borrowed machines early and run them efficiently had salvaged most of their crop. Farmers who had waited for the manufacturer's solution, out of pride or genuine belief that the situation would resolve faster than it did, had lost more. The losses were real, and in some cases would affect operations through the following year. What changed in the weeks after the crisis ended was not dramatic in any single visible way. It was the kind of change that happens in the accumulated weight of small adjustments, in what people said when they were somewhere other than Gorse Farm, in how they described what they had seen there, and whether the word boneyard occurred to them when they thought about the west lot. Mabel herself did not track these changes. She was tracking other things. The mowing machine with the replaced bearing was now in the fourth stage of its evaluation and performing correctly. Prudy had completed her first independent documentation of a machine entry, and Mabel had read it twice, found one notation inconsistency, said so, and Prudy had corrected it without argument and without being asked to explain her original notation, because she already understood why it was wrong. Cass had identified on his own a worn pitman arm on one of the returned harvesters during a receiving inspection he conducted while Mabel was at the south field, and had documented it in the format she used and set the machine aside with a note that read, Stage 3 reevaluation needed, pitman arm. The pine board had 7 names on it, then 5, then 3. One evening in the second week of September it had none, which was the first evening since the beginning of August that the board was clear. Mabel stood in front of it for a moment with a feeling she could not name cleanly. Something less like relief than like with the return of a rhythm that had been interrupted long enough to feel unfamiliar when it came back. She picked up the pencil. She put a new name on the board, the mowing machine in the west lot, now entering its 5th evaluation stage. She had promised herself she would complete before the end of the month. The 5th stage was the hitch and draft system. She wrote the machine's estimated completion date and the components she expected to address. Then she went to the south field to finish what was left of her own harvest, which had waded through the whole of patient and entirely without opinion about what the month had required of her. The Drover County Agricultural Society held its annual meeting in the second week of December in the Tulloch Grange Hall, which smelled of wood smoke and oiled leather, and the particular closeness of a building that held more people than it was designed for when the temperature outside dropped below freezing. Mabel had attended this meeting twice before in her life, once as a girl with her father and once in its first year of farming when he had wanted to introduce himself to the county's established operators. She had not attended since. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November, delivered by the postal rider who came through the Gorse Farm lane twice weekly. It was written on the society's letterhead, signed by the secretary, and asked whether she would be willing to address the winter meeting on the subject of preventive maintenance practices for farm equipment operating under Kansas conditions. An invitation to speak at the Drover County Agricultural Society's annual meeting was not something that had, in the previous history of that organization, been extended to a woman farming alone on 118 acres. She read it twice. She set it on the bench next to the note she was currently cornfilling, went back to the mowing machine in the west lot, and thought about the letter while she worked through the draft system. Not because she needed to think about it to make a decision, but because decisions made too quickly sometimes had gaps in them that became apparent later. By evening, she had decided. She wrote her acceptance on a half sheet of paper, sealed it, and left it on the fence post for the postal rider. Prudy, when she heard, had a reaction that was not quite the one Mabel expected. She was quiet for a moment, turning it over, then said with the blunt precision that had come to characterize how she said things of importance, "What are you going to say that they'll actually use?" It was the right question. Not what would impress them, not what would make the case for what she had done during the harvest season, but what they would leave the hall capable of applying to their own operations. Mabel was not going to talk about the summer. That was not a lesson. That was an outcome. What she wanted to talk about was the structure behind the outcome, the 5-stage framework, the logic of working from primary structures outward, the specific failure modes that preventive inspection catches before they become season-ending events. She was going to talk about the crankshaft, not the particular crankshaft from the Buckeye binder in 1883, though that story was in the background of everything she would say. She was going to talk about the general category of failure that crankshaft represented, the internal damage that does not announce itself through any visible symptom until the moment it concludes catastrophically. She was going to talk about it in terms of what a farmer could actually do, with tools already in most equipment sheds, to evaluate a shaft before trusting his season to it. Prudy sat with her own notebook open while Mabel worked through this out loud. The scratching of pencil on Prudy's page, a sound Mabel had grown accustomed to without noticing when the adjustment had happened. "You should bring the shaft," Prudy said, without looking up. "The study piece from the Buckeye." Mabel looked at her. "If they can see the fracture line," Prudy said, "they'll understand what you're telling them about internal failure. If it's only words, half of them will think they already know." This was the right observation. coming from someone who had been in the workshop long enough to understand something Mabel had taken years to formalize. That mechanical knowledge passes more reliably through the hands and eyes than through the ears alone. She got the shaft from the shelf, turned it in the light, found the fracture line with her thumbnail, the lateral crack through the journal that had cost her 7 weeks and $190, and had taught her more than any of the repairs that had succeeded. She set it on the bench, put it in the traveling crate, with the packing. Prudy wrapped it without being told how. The Grange Hall on the evening of the December meeting was fuller than Mabel had expected. A gathering that would normally draw 40 or 50 men had drawn somewhere closer to 80, which meant men were standing along the back wall and in the space beside the wood stove where the coats were hung. She arrived early enough to set the shaft on the table at the front of the room and have a moment of stillness before anyone arrived to fill the space with their noise and their assumptions. Fordham Briley arrived 20 minutes before the meeting opened. He came in with 3 other men from the South Quarter, men who moved through the hall with the ease of people who had been in every iteration of this room for decades. He took a seat in the front row, which was not where she had expected him to be. He did not look at her when he came in, but he looked at the table, at the crankshaft lying on its section of canvas, and his expression shifted in a way not visible to anyone who was not already watching for it. The meeting was called to order by the Society's chairman, Elfred Gatch, who introduced Mabel with a brevity that was either respect for her time or reluctance to elaborate on the circumstances of the invitation. She was not concerned with which. She walked to the front. She did not begin with the summer. She began with the crankshaft. She held it up and turned it so the fracture line caught the lamplight. She asked the men in the room how many of them had inspected the primary load-bearing shafts on their harvesters before the last season. Not serviced, not oiled. Inspected, turned under light, tested for irregularity in the bore surface, evaluated as a structural component rather than as background infrastructure. The silence that answered her was the silence of people asked a question they did not expect, recalculating whether they could answer it honestly. She put the shaft on the table. She described in precise and specific language what the fracture line represented, how it had developed over years of normal stress at a point the metal's original casting had left slightly thinner than the surrounding structure, how it had been completely invisible at surface inspection, how it had been identifiable only through a bore surface check that took 4 minutes with a piece of wire and cost nothing. She described the 4 minutes. She demonstrated them with the shaft on the table, showing what the wire detected when it encountered the fracture zone, a change in resistance so subtle it could be missed if the movement moved fast, or if the operator was not specifically attending to it. She moved through the 5 stages of evaluation, using specific component names and specific failure modes for each stage, using numbers where numbers were available, tolerances, operating temperatures, cycles per hour under Kansas harvest conditions. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the people in them are concentrating rather than merely polite. At the point in the presentation where she had planned to stop, she did not stop. There was a quality of attention in the room, telling her the stopping point she had prepared was not the right one, that the men in front of her were in a condition of genuine receptivity that would close if she let it. And so she continued into a section she had not formally prepared, about the relationship between preventive inspection and equipment longevity, about the specific calculations she had found in her own records regarding the cost of a systematic maintenance schedule against the cost of reactive repair after failure. She had those numbers in the notebook Prudy had brought and set on the table beside the shaft. She opened it and read them because they were more persuasive than any general claim she could make. A harvester maintained on a Stage 1 structural inspection schedule every 2 seasons had, in her records, a median operational lifespan of 23 years with the original primary components intact. A harvester maintained reactively, serviced when something visibly broke, had a median span of 11 years before the primary structure required replacement or the machine was retired. The difference between those 2 numbers, in the context of what a new harvester cost and what a farm of 200 acres or more could absorb in capital expenditure a single decade, was a number every man in the room could calculate himself without her help. She closed the notebook. The questions came for 40 minutes. Briley waited until the hall had substantially emptied before he moved to the front of the room. Most of the men who had stayed to ask questions had asked about specific machines or specific component types, and she had answered with the same specificity she had used through the presentation. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the shaft. "How many machines do you have in evaluation right now?" she told him. 4 in various stages, 1 completed and ready for sale, 2 that had come in during October from farms as far as 12 miles away, because word had traveled and people had begun to seek her out rather than waiting for coincidence. He turned the shaft over on the table with one finger, not picking it up. "I have a seed drill I bought in 1881. Primary shaft has never been formally inspected. She waited. I'd like to know what you'd find. It came out with the directness of a man who has decided to stop performing the version of himself he is most comfortable with and say the actual thing. Not to repair it. To know. She named a price for an inspection-only evaluation. It was fair and it was not discounted, because discounting it would have misrepresented the value of what an inspection was, and Briley understood value clearly enough that a discount would have confused the transaction rather than facilitating it. He agreed without negotiating. He told her he would bring the drill the following week. He picked up his coat from the rack near the door and stopped with his hand on it. He looked back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the recalculation of the day he returned the harvester, but something further along, something that had moved from recognition toward an understanding he not entirely comfortable with, but was not trying to avoid. There were men in this room tonight who called your property a boneyard within the last 2 years. Some of them asked you tonight they should have known the answers to already. He was not saying this to excuse them or to position himself outside the group. I was in the same category. Mabel folded the canvas around the shaft. You used what you were offered and you brought the machine back sound. That's all I asked. It's not all you deserved. She placed the wrapped shaft in the traveling crate and secured the latch. She had thought at various points through the summer and into the fall about what she would feel if really ever said something direct and unreserved about the years of dismissiveness, not cruelty, not malice, but the consistent casual contempt of a man who had decided what she was without investigating his conclusion. She had thought she might feel something complicated. What she felt was simpler than that. The accounting was settled. She could move forward. Bring the drill Thursday, before noon. The drill arrived Thursday. The primary shaft was sound, which she confirmed through the bore inspection she had described in the hall and documented with the same entry format she used for every evaluation. She found 2 secondary issues, a worn disc bearing on the third gang from the left and a cracked seed tube in the distribution assembly, and documented both with the parts required, the estimated labor, and the priority order she recommended. She gave him the written assessment. He read it in the workshop doorway with the December light coming in over his shoulder. And when he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man reading a document more useful than he had expected. How long for the repairs? 2 weeks for the bearing. The seed tube I can do today if you leave the drill. He left the drill. While she worked on the seed tube, Prudy conducted the documentation for the secondary disc bearing evaluation on her own, working through Mabel's format without prompting, writing the component description, the observed condition, and the failure risk assessment in language close enough to Mabel's standard that she could read it without having to reframe the terminology. Close, but not identical in one place. Prudy had used a different notation for the failure risk category, technically accurate, but not matching the system Mabel had developed for cross-referencing across machine types. Mabel pointed to it. Prudy looked. If the notation isn't consistent, then in 5 years, when you're looking at 30 notebooks and you need to find every disc-bearing failure assessment for drills of this type, you won't be able to search by notation. You'll have to read every page. Prudy understood this immediately, not as a rule about notation, but as a principle about what records were for. She corrected it, then went back through the 6 earlier entries she made that week and corrected the notation in those as well, without being asked. Kelly came to the farm on the Saturday before Christmas, with a question different from the practical questions he had been bringing through the fall. He had been talking to 3 other farmers from the North Quarter who had come through the Grange meeting and who had, in the weeks since, been in contact with each other in ways Cass described as purposeful rather than casual. They were talking about whether there was a way to formalize what they had seen during the harvest crisis and during the meeting, not just as individual farmers making better decisions about their own equipment, but as something operating at a county level, a standing arrangement for shared evaluation, shared parts sourcing, periodic instruction. Mabel listened to all of this without interrupting, working on the disc-bearing replacement for Briley's drill, not putting the tool down while he talked. What Cass was describing was a real thing. She had seen the shape of it forming through the fall in the accumulation of men who came to the workshop with questions and left with answers and came back with better questions, and eventually stopped needing to come at all for the simpler things because they had learned to address those themselves. The logical extension of that pattern was exactly what he was naming. What she was also considering was what would be lost if she moved in that direction too quickly, or at a scale outrunning her ability to maintain the standards that had made any of it work. The workshop had grown through the summer from a solitary operation into something that held 3 or 4 people at a time on its busiest days, and it had held its quality through that growth because the growth had been gradual enough that she could see every failure before it became a practice. Tell me what the 3 of them are thinking in terms of structure, she said. He told her. It was more considered than she had expected. Not a proposal for a large organization, but for something much smaller. A periodic gathering at a rotating location account of the shared parts inventory that individual farmers could contribute to and draw from according to a system of recorded credits, and a practice of inspection sharing, where a farmer who had developed a particular competency would make that competency available to neighbors who needed it. She recognized her own framework in the outline, not because Cass had copied it, but because the framework worked, and people who encountered working things tend to extend them in the direction they already point. Who's running the records? Cass's expression shifted slightly. We were hoping that was something you'd consider. She looked at him. Not the whole of it, just the structure, the system for how the records work, what you tell us it should look like, and we build it from there. What she was being asked for was not her time in the way the summer had taken her time. She was being asked for the logic of the system, the design rather than the execution. That was the kind of contribution that could multiply without requiring her to be present at every multiplication. Come back after the new year, with the other 3. I'll have something written out. January arrived with weather more cooperative than December had suggested, which was not a thing she trusted, because Kansas January was not a season that owed anyone cooperation. She worked through the first 2 weeks on the written outline Cass had asked for, which was more involved than she had anticipated, because translating a system she as embodied knowledge into language precise enough for someone else to implement it required articulating things she had never needed to articulate before. Prudy helped with this, not by doing the articulation for Mabel, but by asking at intervals what a specific element meant when it was not immediately clear from what had been written, which forced Mabel to identify the places where her own prose had assumed knowledge the reader would not have. The document was 11 pages when finished, written in Mabel's handwriting on the same composition paper she used for the notebooks, covering the 5-stage evaluation protocol, the parts classification system, the notation standards for condition assessment, the criteria for parts pricing when selling from inventory, and the record-keeping requirements for any borrowed equipment transaction. It was specific enough to be followed by someone who had not worked alongside her, which was the test she applied to every sentence. Cass and the 3 other farmers came on the first Thursday of February. They sat in the workshop on the 3 available stools and on the upturned crate Prudy had quietly placed near the bench before they arrived. Mabel went through the 11 pages with them, not reading aloud, but using the document as a map for a conversation that covered 2 hours thoroughly. One of the 3 men, a farmer named Winsboro from the North Quarter, who had the particular quality of a person whose intelligence expresses itself as skepticism before it expresses itself as anything else, asked whether the system could hold its integrity if the rotating meeting was hosted by farmers, whose understanding of the evaluation framework varied significantly from one another. It was the best question asked that day. The answer was that it could not. If the variation was too great, and if there was no mechanism for bringing weaker participants up to a minimum standard before they were operating within the system. The mechanism she proposed was a prerequisite. Any farmer who wanted to contribute to the shared parts inventory or draw from it needed to complete a supervised evaluation of at least one before being granted inventory access. The supervised evaluation did not need to be conducted by her. It could be conducted by anyone who had already completed one. This made the qualification self-propagating. Every person who entered the system became capable of qualifying the next person, which meant the system could grow without requiring her to personally supervise every new participant. Winsboro looked at the document and then at her with an expression that had moved from skepticism to something more closely resembling respect. Though on his particular face, the 2 things were close enough in appearance that only the direction of the movement distinguished them. You've been running a formal system all along. You just haven't named it. Naming things before they're proven is how you end up defending a name instead of improving a practice. The letter from Amos Fetter at the Tulloch Savings and Agricultural Bank arrived on a Wednesday in March, 6 months after the harvest crisis had concluded and 3 months after the Grange Hall meeting. It requested a meeting at Mabel's convenience to discuss the existing terms of the Gorse Farm loan and the possibility of revising them in light of current circumstances. She read it 3 times, not because the language was unclear, but because the implications needed to be assessed from more than one angle before she trusted her own reading of them. The loan had been renewed in 1882 under terms reflecting the bank assessment of a risk. A woman farming alone on marginal acreage with no succession plan and a financial history that included her husband's illness costs in the final year before his death. Those terms had not been revisited since. The interest rate they carried was 2 percentage points above what Briley's comparable loan was structured at, which she knew because Briley had mentioned it, apparently without meaning to, during one of the conversations they had in the workshop over the course of the winter. She wrote back the same afternoon and said she would come to the bank. Prudy drove with her, not because Mabel had asked her to, but because Prudy had, over the months since the summer, developed a habit of being present at things that were likely to matter, and she had correctly identified this as one of those things. She sat in the wagon with her notebook and said nothing on the road to Tulloch, which was the right thing to do. Feder received them in his office, a room she had sat in 3 times before, each time in the context of a negotiation that had not gone in her favor and which she could accepted because the alternative was losing the farm. He arranged himself behind his desk with the particular neutrality of a banker, conducting a meeting whose outcome he has already substantially decided. He proposed a restructured loan, the interest rate revised down by 2 points, bringing it to the same structure as the largest farms in the county, the repayment term extended by 4 years. A line of credit attached to the loan at a rate he described as reflecting the bank's assessment of Gorse Farm's current operational profile. Mabel sat with her hands folded on the edge of his desk and listened to all of it before she said anything. What changed your assessment? Feder considered how to answer this. He was not a man who talked around things unnecessarily, which was one of the qualities she had always respected in him even when she found his decisions constraining. The workshop activity since August. The Grange meeting in December. The inquiry I received in January from Winsboro, who was asking whether the bank would consider participating in a parts inventory credit arrangement. He paused. Fordham Briley came to see me in November. She looked at him. He told me I had the farm's risk profile wrong. He told me the profile had been wrong for some years and that he had personal evidence of this and that I should take another look. Mabel was quiet for a moment. The weight of that settled into its place. Not a surprise, because she had understood since the day Briley returned the harvester that something in him had genuinely shifted, but as something requiring her to update her accounting of what the summer had actually produced. Briley had not mentioned his visit to Feder in any of their subsequent conversations. He had gone, said what needed to be said, and said nothing more about it. She recognized the same approach she would have taken. She signed the revised loan agreement. She read every clause before signing it, which took 14 minutes, and Feder waited without comment. When she was finished, she set the pen down and looked at the document the way she looked at a completed notebook entry, not checking it again but acknowledging it. Outside, on the seat, Prudy opened her notebook to an empty page and began writing. Mabel did not ask what she was writing. She picked up the reins and turned the horses toward the road home. What Briley did, Prudy said, still writing. Is it something you expected from him? No, Prudy consisted this. Does it change how you think about what happened in August? Mabel thought about the 9 days of 4 in the morning starts. The pine board with 10 names on it. The evening Cass walked in with a covered pot and 2 men behind him. The 40 minutes she had spent in a Grange hall in December talking to 80 men about a bore surface check that took 4 minutes with a piece of wire. The crankshaft on the table with the fracture line that had cost her everything it needed to cost her in 1883 so that it could be exactly the right object in exactly the right room 4 years later. What happened in August was the result of everything that happened before August. Briley coming to Feder is part of the same thing. Prudy finished writing. She looked up at the road ahead. So none of it was separate. Nothing ever is. Spring came to Drover County with the particular Kansas quality of arriving before anyone was fully ready for it. The ground soft from snowmelt in the low and still hard in the higher sections where the sun had not reached long enough. Mabel planted the north field in the 2nd week of April, earlier than the previous year, because the soil temperature in that section had been running 2 degrees higher than her records showed for the same period in 1885. Information she had because she had been recording it for 4 years in a small table at the back of the current notebook. The West lot had 9 machines in various stages of evaluation, more than it had ever held at one time. 3 had come from farms in the North Quarter through the arrangement Cass and Winsboro, and the others had formalized over the winter meetings. 2 had come from a farm 12 miles east, whose owner she had not met before he appeared at the gate in February with a horse-drawn wagon and a transmission problem he had described in a letter the week before. The letter had been written in the format of her own evaluation documentation, which meant someone had shown him the 11-page document, and he had used it as a template for his initial assessment before bringing the machine in. He had gotten the primary structure section right and had done a partial and reasonably accurate transmission assessment on his own, before identifying the point at which his knowledge ended. He had noted that endpoint clearly in his letter, with the specific component he could not evaluate and his reasoning for why he could not evaluate it. This was exactly what the system was supposed to produce, and she had read his letter twice on the morning it arrived, with the feeling of someone who has watched something work the way it was designed to work. Prudy was running the receiving inspection on the Eastern Farmer's machine on the Tuesday of the 3rd week of April, with Mabel present but not directing available but not intervening, watching for the specific moments when intervention would be necessary and recognizing that those moments had not arrived. They had not arrived. Prudy moved through the primary structure stage with a precision that was her own now, not a copy of Mabel's movements, but an expression of the same underlying logic, through a different body, with different hands and different observational emphases, which was correct. Two practitioners of the same framework should not look identical. They should look like themselves. She found something in the third stage that the Easter farmer's self-assessment had not caught. A crack in the secondary gear housing that was hairline at the surface and wider internally. The kind of fracture that would not have been found through a surface inspection. And the man's lip passed over because he had not known to look for it there. She documented it. She wrote the failure risk assessment, the component designation, the estimated labor, and the priority classification high, because the housing crack would propagate under operating load to the point of catastrophic failure within the season. She handed the assessment to Mabel. Mabel read it. It was correct. The notation was consistent with the established system. The failure risk language was precise without being alarmist. The priority classification was accurate. There was nothing in it she would have written differently. She handed it back without comment because the appropriate response to work that is fully correct is not comment but continuation. Prudy put the assessment in the machine's folder and went back to the fourth stage. The morning light came through the workshop door. At the angle it came through in April, lower than it would be in summer, casting longer shadows across the floor from the shelves along the west wall. The shelves held what they had always held. Parts organized by type, by compatibility, by condition, except that there were more of them now, and small machines had passed through the evaluation process over the winter, and whose usable components had been added to the inventory. Under the credit system, Cass and the others were operating. Mabel stood at the bench and looked at the first notebook, the one that had begun with the Buckeye binder entry in the fall of 1883, and ended somewhere in the middle of the harvest crisis when she had run out of pages and moved to the second one without ceremony. It sat on the shelf above her right hand, between the second notebook and the wall. The spine was worn through to the cardboard backing, and the cover had a watermark from a rain that had caught her with it open in the south field in the summer of 1885. She did not open it. She knew what was in it. What she was aware of, looking at it, was that the distance between the first entry and the current moment was not a distance she could predict from inside the first entry, and that this was not a surprising of object, but was a true one, and that the truth of it did not need to be said to anyone, including herself, more than once. She turned back to the bench. There was a seed drill waiting at the start of its first evaluation stage, brought in that morning by a farmer from the South Quarter who had attended the Grange meeting and had been waiting since December for the right time to bring it in. The drill was an older model, 12 years at minimum, with the specific gear configuration she knew could develop bearing stress at a particular point in the primary shaft assembly under sustained operation in sandy soil. She opened the notebook to a clean page. She wrote the date. She wrote the machine description and the serial number and the owner's name and the date of acquisition. She began the first stage. Outside, the April morning continued doing what it did across Sawgrass Flats, the light moving, the wind finding the dry places and lifting what it could carry, the ground giving back the heat it had held through the cold months in a slow, uncalculated exchange that had no concern for the human arrangements conducted on its surface. The workshop door stood open. The sound of Prudy's work in the East Bay came through it without interruption. The particular rhythm of a person who has stopped counting her own steps because she knows where she is going. Somewhere on the North Road, a wagon was moving in the direction of the farm, and the man driving it had a letter in his pocket describing the format Mabel had written, the preliminary assessment of a machine he hoped she could help him understand. She did not know this yet. She would know it when he arrived, and she would look at what he had written, and she would tell him what the next step was. That was how the work went. That was how it had always gone. She wrote the first entry of the new evaluation in her careful, even hand, and the notebook was open, and the page was filling.